Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is apologies for the slightly delayed start. We've had one or two technical glitches this morning, but hopefully we're live and kicking now and everybody can actually hear us okay. Hopefully you have all of your controls sorted in terms of sound, etc. We do, hopefully all of us have the ability to see the dashboard. There is a hand icon on the dashboard. If you can actually just locate that and raise your hand now, that'll just give us the ability to do a little sound check. So thank you very much. I can see lots of people raising their hands already. Yeah, so it looks as if we're in business and hopefully everybody can see the screen as well, so that's good. Fine. Okay, so I will now just drop everybody's hands, so thank you for that. Welcome to the webinar. As I say, we're talking about disadvantaged pupils this morning, and this is your webinar, so please, with the dashboard in front of you, you have the opportunity to ask questions at any time, either by typing them into the dashboard itself and hitting send, or if you'd like to come on live and ask a question, then please do raise your hand at any time, and I'll do my best to be able to invite you along. I'm Steve Barker and I'm actually facilitating the webinar this morning. There's a few bits of information about me on that slide there, which I won't take your time by actually talking you through all of them. I'm actually here representing Better Governor this morning. We're actually an online information and development service for school governors, both in maintained and academy schools. And if you haven't checked out our website, then please do. It's free to register and it's free to access all of the published content. So please do take a look at that. I can see we have a couple of people coming on actually saying that they don't have any sound at the moment. The sound is definitely working our end, so hopefully those people will figure out that it may, okay, we've got a couple of people coming back now saying that their sound is fine. It may well be it's your own sound controls. I realise that's not much help if you can't hear me saying that at the moment. Okay, lovely. Lots of people are saying the sound's fine now, so I think we'll continue. We did have a few glitches, as I say, with the GoTo platform this morning. If you can bear with me just 1 second. Thank you very much, Sandra. There's a useful bit of advice there telling people to actually dial in if they can't actually get the sound this way. I will just put a question, something on the question panel right now. Lovely. Okay. So, with no more ado, let's actually think about what the aims of this morning's session are. I think it's important when we're talking about disadvantaged pupil to just get some kind of clarity in terms of what we mean by disadvantage. It does tend to mean different things in different settings, and I think that's true within the education system as a whole. Different people have different understandings, and we'll spend a few moments just actually exploring that. Obviously, one of the key elements of the definition is always going to be about pupil premium and those pupils who are generating pupil premium for schools. So we're going to be looking at pupil premium just as an overview, but think about how schools are actually using that additional funding that's coming into them, and what as governors, as trustees, we know about that spending, not just in terms of where it's being directed, but also is it actually making a difference? Is it actually having the impact that we want it to have in our schools? And I think, as with all of these things, it's very important for us as governors to think about, do we understand what's happening with pupil premium? Are we asking enough questions? Are we asking the right questions? So as we go through, we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about the sort of questions that we should be asking about our overall strategy for pupil premium within our school. And I've got one or two resources to talk about and to share with you as we go through. And of course, most important of all, disadvantaged pupils are part absolutely of the total pupil population in our school. We want to ensure that all pupils are making progress in their learning, and we need to be ensuring that we are monitoring the progress of disadvantaged pupils as assiduously as we do all others. So that's what I'm going to be aiming to cover in this morning's session. But as I say, please, if you have any questions at all, then do type them into the question box, or if you'd like to raise your hand at any stage, and I'll unmute your microphone and actually let you come live on air to ask the question. Okay, so just thought we'd start off by thinking about this definition of disadvantage. And yeah, clearly we all know what disadvantage means, I guess, in a general context. And I've probably rather patronisingly apologise for that, but used the Oxford English Dictionary definition there. So if we think about disadvantage, it's about unfavourable circumstances or conditions that have an impact on reducing chances of success or effectiveness. And I think that the reason I've used that is I think that's actually quite a helpful definition for us, because this is really within an education setting, within a school setting. Disadvantaged pupils are those who probably got barriers in their pathway which could impact in a negative way on their ability to succeed in schools. But I do think we need to think, all of us as governors, in our own settings, in our own schools, academies, etc. What's our definition of disadvantage? Is it a narrow one, or is it a slightly broader one? Ofsted published something on their website very recently, which I've put in italics at the bottom of this slide here. Whilst all local authorities, preschool providers and schools that Ofsted visited, and that was actually in a recent survey exercise, defined disadvantages in terms of family income, the most effective settings had a much wider view. Now, I just wonder if anybody's got any thoughts there, and then please do type them in the question box and share them with the rest of us. But I wonder what in your schools the definition is of disadvantage, and what might we want to see included in that wider view. We'll come on and reflect on that in a few moments. So I think this whole question, okay, Solomon, thank you very much, has just put something up on the screen here to say that health is part of it as well. Yeah, I think disadvantage can actually range from educational disadvantage, social disadvantage, health, economic, all of those factors. It could even be because of social care factors or social care involvement. Children who are under the care of social care because of child protection, safeguarding concerns, that's going to have an impact. That's going to be a barrier to their achieving in our schools, and I think that's absolutely something we should be considering. I've got this slide here, and there's an awful lot of information on this slide, and I'm not intending to actually talk all through it. This is a slide containing some information that comes from the Department for Education. It's from June last year. It's the most recent data that there is, but this is actually based on national curriculum assessments of Key Stage 2. So when children get to the age of 11, then this is the outcomes that were achieved last academic year, and this year's haven't been published yet. And you can see you've got the different bands across the bottom there, different bands, different groups of pupils. So you've got pupils that have English as a first language, those that don't, boys versus girls in the blue box, disadvantaged versus all others, free school meals versus all others, and special educational needs and disabilities. And I can see Louise has just put up on the screen there in terms of disadvantaged definition in her school. We're talking about pupils potentially who actually arrive in the school but not at perhaps the beginning of the academic year, and particularly those that have English as additional language. And certainly that can be a very real barrier, and we're going to come on and talk about barriers to learning and in more detail a little bit later. But that does echo some of these groups, and this isn't intended to be an exhaustive list that I've got on the screen at the moment. But I think one of the things that I would suggest that you look at, that middle block there, and also, SEN perhaps, let's focus on that one first, the orange block on the far right. Yes, there's a very real gap there, but of course pupils have a variety of special needs and disabilities, and a lot of those special educational needs will in fact result in either a delay or a barrier to learning of some sort. But if we look at disadvantage, that's got a huge gap there, 21% at the end of Key Stage 2 between those that are not disadvantaged and those that are. And of course, if we think about the government's definition of disadvantage, that does, for the most part, reflect those entitled to free school meals. It's slightly broader than that. We'll come on to that in just a few moments. And therefore, for me, it's not a huge surprise that the gap between free school meals, the yellow block on the chart in front of you, or the yellow blocks, I should say, is of equal proportion to that for disadvantaged pupils. And I think one of the things I would urge all of us to think about here is these are not discrete groups. There will be some significant overlap between these groups. And if you think back perhaps to your own time at school and thinking about when you learned about Venn diagrams, there will be some interesting overlaps or intersections here. So for example, the overlap between disadvantaged and special educational needs. There will be some special educational needs pupils who are disadvantaged. There will be, as Louise has indicated, some pupils with English as an additional language who are also disadvantaged. And I think one of the opportunities for schools that isn't always taken up, and I think it's an area that governors could perhaps develop their questioning skills in, is, well, where there are those overlaps between the groups, what's the school doing to isolate those factors which can be impacted by focusing on areas of disadvantage, as opposed to perhaps other areas which could provide barriers to learning? And that's something that I think all of us should perhaps be thinking about. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. It's very similar, but this is actually moving up the age range now. So this is actually looking at the attainment gap by pupil groups again, but at age 16. So this is at the end of GCSEs. And what you will see here is that we've got some similar gaps, but the noticeable thing is here, that group of pupils who have English as additional language have almost caught up with their peers who don't have English as an additional language, where English is their first language. They've almost caught up by the end of their time in secondary school, certainly in Key Stage 4. We've still got a gender gap, and I think most people are aware of that. But disadvantage, yes, there is some closure there. It's narrowed a little bit, but there is still a gap at GCSE performance. Similarly, free school meals, a little bit wider there, but again, we're talking broadly the same group. And of course, whilst the SEN gap isn't quite as big, there is still a gap there, as one would probably expect. So again, I don't want to dwell on those groups, but just to give you a little bit of context. And as I say, this information, or the charts rather, the information comes from the Department for Education. The charts are actually published by the Education Endowment Foundation, which is what the EEF stands for at the bottom of the slide there. And if as governors and trustees you're not aware of the Education Endowment Foundation, good idea to, whatever your search engine is, to put that in the search engine and just have a look at their website. Certainly go back to school and ask, to the school, or certainly does the school have an awareness of the Education Endowment Foundation, but more importantly, do they use the resources on there? Because what the Education Endowment Foundation does is spend an awful lot of money. It's a charity, part funded by government. Most of their funding is used for research into how do we close that gap, narrow the gap, diminish the difference, whatever phrase we want to use, between disadvantaged pupils and non-disadvantaged pupils in our schools. It's still a major issue, it's still a key plank of government policy, of course, and it's something that all of us need to actually be thinking about as governors. And of course, disadvantage is still an issue. It's been around for a while now in terms of priority for government, but it's still around right now. And I've just put a couple of snippets that I found on, it wasn't yesterday, day before yesterday, so on Tuesday this week, just by doing a little scour of the online press. Article on the right there comes from Guardian Education, talking about a very recent OECD study, which is talking about approaches to disadvantaged pupils. This one just happens to be making the point that where you've got larger groups of disadvantaged pupils, the expectations that schools have are not always as high as they might be elsewhere. We've got an item that was actually published on the BBC News site on 1st of November on the right there, which is talking about how spending now is perhaps rather more directed towards disadvantaged pupils than it has been in the past. A little bit of note of caution on that one in my view, as a personal view, but of course because of the change, of the rather seismic changes in school funding, a lot of this shift there that's being talked about may be proportionate as opposed to absolute. And then you've got something at the bottom, proportion of poor pupils in education, employment, apprenticeships is falling. That's something that we all ought to be very concerned about, because one of the other performance measures for schools that Ofsted are actually very interested now is destination data, particularly for secondary schools we're talking here, of course. But what are those disadvantaged pupils actually doing once they leave school? And there's a lot of information out there at the moment that is suggesting that the outcomes, because of the opportunities, are not as great for those for that group of pupils. So if you're a secondary governor, certainly something to think about. But even if you're a primary school governor, we spend a lot of time now talking about readiness for education. We talk about pupils at the bottom end of the age spectrum. Are they ready for school readiness? We talk about Key Stage 2 readiness. And of course, there is also the growing awareness now of the concept of being secondary ready. And secondary ready isn't just about having the uniform, the appropriate kit and attitudes, etc. It's also about having the right standard of education to be able to enable you to access the secondary curriculum. And that's something that we should be thinking about, particularly for our disadvantaged pupils. And again, some information that's come from the DFE here. This is actually rather older, based on the same set of data we were looking at on those slides a few moments ago, but 3 years previous data. DFE view is that these statements, these 4 bullet points here, which are basic assertions which do have an influence on government policy at the moment, they still hold true in 2018 as they did 4 years ago. And let's just look at these one by one. I mean, the first one there, young people who are leaving school with at least 5 good GCSEs, which include English and maths, increase their lifetime productivity returns. I've quoted these directly from the DFE site. Why they're actually expressing it that way, I'm not quite sure, but this is lifetime earning potential we're talking about here. But 5 good GCSEs, including English and maths, means that your likelihood is you will earn more than £100,000 more in your lifetime than other people might. Go on to say that even just having 2 GCSE passes versus no passes at all, no qualifications at all, is associated with larger economic gains. So those youngsters that at least have 2 GCSEs will go on and achieve more in life. I think the key one for me is this third bullet point here. Modest improvements in GCSE grades is associated with positive lifetime earning potential. And what that's saying is where schools are using pupil premium funding and putting other strategies in place to support pupils, where they are perhaps at those borderlines between what we used to call the CD borderline, but now what is probably the 4-5 or the 5-6 borderline under the new GCSEs, where schools are investing time and effort in supporting those pupils, that can have a major impact on improving the life chances of those young people. And I think the last one, which we call the last bullet point here, which is the one that drives a lot of government policy at the moment, of course, is the fact, and this isn't new, it's not rocket science, we all know that those youngsters leaving education without any qualifications at all, that does actually result in a fairly heavy cost to society. These are the young people who would go on and possibly end up what's referred to as NEET. That's an acronym for not in employment, education or training. And of course, then they become part of a part of the benefit system. So they are net drawers, shall we say, from the system as opposed to net contributors. And that's where the economic cost actually comes from. So all of the talk about why pupil premium has been put in place, what the government is trying to do in terms of social mobility at the moment, all of those factors are driven by these 4 bullet points on this slide. And of course, what they ought to be doing is influencing the way that we are putting strategy and policy together in our schools as well. So let's move on and just think a little bit about the pupil premium, because the pupil premium, of course, is the government's response to this idea that their disadvantage does have a hugely detrimental impact on educational outcomes. So what the government did was actually create this fund, and it's now got a fairly significant proportion since it was first introduced. And the idea is that pupil premium is additional funding for schools. It's available to all, and the reason we use this term publicly funded includes maintained schools and of course academies and free schools. So all of those schools are publicly funded, and therefore all of them have access to pupil premium funding. And the idea is that it is specifically to target disadvantaged pupils, irrespective of their ability, with the idea that we close the gap. So, ability tends to be associated with academic ability, but if this may have an impact on social ability, on future earnings power, etc. So it's a question of, again, coming back to that definition, how broad do we want our definition of a disadvantage to be, and how creative can we be in terms of ensuring that pupil premium is spent to have the greatest impact on all disadvantaged pupils, irrespective of where they are in terms of ability. Because this may be something to do with aspiration. If you've got a fairly able pupil that comes from a household where perhaps you're into second or sometimes even third generations of workers' families, there's a lot of work to be done there, not just in terms of academic performance, but actually in terms of raising aspirations, opening eyes as to what the future could potentially hold for that young person. So pupil premium itself is aimed at making that difference. It is varying now in terms of its value, and the biggest number of pupils actually attracting it are, of course, within the primary sector, just because of the size of the primary sector. And the current rate of funding is £1,320 per pupil. That starts in reception class and goes right the way through to year 6. At secondary, it's a slightly lower amount, it's £935. And for pupils in care or care leavers, so this is looked after children who are looked after by the local authority, that might be in foster care, it might be in children's homes, or those care leavers, they are attracting a higher rate of £2,300 a year. Now, there's a slight caveat on that one, because the money for looked after children and care leavers doesn't come directly to schools. That is actually controlled by the virtual school in each authority. That's the virtual school for looked after children, and the idea is that they have an overview. They are the corporate parent is the official terminology that's used for those looked after children, and it's their responsibility to decide and determine how that funding is best spent to meet that child's more global needs. So what we need to think about there is, if we have looked after pupils in our school or children who are care leavers, and that can be anybody who's actually left care as a result of either adoption or a special guardianship order being issued, or any other child arrangements previously known as residence orders. All of those can actually qualify for that higher rate. I see we've got a question coming in now from John. Let me just open that question, John. John's saying, who makes the decision that a child is disadvantaged and therefore able to get funding? That's a very good question. I'm just coming on to that now, John. But thank you for the prompt. The government definition for pupil premium entitlement, first and foremost, is free school meals. Anybody who is entitled to free school meal, and of course that doesn't actually include the universal infant free school meal. So this is about the entitlement that comes from access to a particular benefit, and that's the vast majority of pupil premium is funding is actually generated from that particular angle. We then have those pupils who are looked after or care leavers, and that's the one that attracts the higher rate of 2,300. So the rates on this slide that's up in front of you at the moment, the 1,320 and the 935 in primary and secondary respectively, those are for those pupils that actually trigger the free school meals benefit. There is a forces premium as well, and that's for children of the armed forces. It's a much lower value. That is tending now in recent years to be left out of disadvantage. It can mean disadvantage, but it doesn't necessarily. There are an awful lot of children who are the children of members of the armed forces who would not tick any boxes for disadvantage at all. Some of them would maybe have some quite privileged lives. It's actually worth thinking about what that armed forces premium is actually used for, because for the most part, probably what is common with a lot of armed forces children is the very high instance of mobility, moving around from school to school. So very often you will find schools perhaps use the armed forces premium to encourage children to actually participate in enrichment or extracurricular activities as a way of improving their social skills, their ability to make new friends, etc. So I wouldn't actually include the Forces Premium as part of the Pupil Premium. I think we see that quite slightly separately now. Got another question coming from Sandra. How long does the 2,300 last? That is, it's paid every year, and it is able to be drawn for care leavers up to 6 years after they've left care. So it's the same as the free school meals one. You're entitled to it, not just the year that you actually are originally entitled, but for a further 6 years. So a lot of people talk about the ever six rule. That's where that comes from. So if any time in the last 6 years you have been eligible, then the school still receives that premium for 6 years after that. We've got a question here from Fiona. How do schools spend the premium? Which resources are they used towards? Let me come back to that, Fiona, if I may, because we're going to move onto that right now, in fact. So let's move the slide forward and just think about, well, okay, we know that we've got a pupil premium. You will know, hopefully, this will come up a little bit later, about how many pupils in your school are actually generating pupil premium. And for some of our schools, that can result in a rather large amount of money. One of the schools where I'm chair of governors is a very large secondary school with just under 2,000 pupils. We are generating best part of £500,000 a year in pupil premium. That's a lot of money, and clearly there are some significant spending decisions to be made in schools relating to that particular stream of funding. And of course, that poses a whole raft of questions for us as governors as to how are those decisions made, what difference are they making, are they making a difference in terms of narrowing that gap? And that's all about accountability, of course, but it's not just accountability when we're thinking about compliance, because there are, about pupil premium, because there are some compliance issues as well. The first one is both about accountability and compliance, but compliance only in maintained schools. And that's something that came out just a couple of years ago now. There is now a statutory requirement that all schools in the maintained sector do produce and publish on their website what's called a pupil premium strategy. I'm going to come on and say a little bit more about that in just a few moments. But before I do that, I just want to say that that pupil premium strategy might be mandatory in maintained schools and not in academies. It is still regarded as good practice in academies. And I've got a template I'm going to share with you in just a few moments, which I think does give you a very good idea about why it's regarded as good practice, because it is a way of setting out what the school is trying to achieve, its vision and its strategy for meeting the needs of those disadvantaged pupils in our school. As I said, we would need to see that on the school website. The school's pupil premium strategy, but the school website has a whole load of other areas of compliance. So if you're not familiar with the compliance aspects of that, what you might want to do, DfE published the day before yesterday an updated version of what schools must publish online, and the mirror version what academies must publish online. Those are on the front page of the Department for Education website at this moment in time. Well worth having a look. We will be publishing an article on Better Governor later on today on both of those, giving you the links, etc. So if you're not already registered, do that, and that'll be an easy way to actually find those out. But when you look at that document, what schools must publish online, you will see that there are a number of requirements there which do impact on pupil premium. Is one of the largest sections within that, and that's a good area for governors to actually focus on, particularly those that are looking at how compliant is our website. I would suggest that's a very good function for at least one governor in every single school. One of the things that the pupil premium strategy does, and also a statutory requirement on the website, on the website, is that we think about what difference are we making? What's the impact of the spending of pupil premium in my school? How is it actually making a difference to those pupils who are attracting the pupil premium? And as I say, I'm going to come on and give you a snapshot view of the pupil premium strategy document in just a moment, but that does help focus the mind on perhaps what we might want to do as opposed to what we are doing right now. And the other area to actually think about from an accountability perspective, of course, is Ofsted. And Ofsted have responsibility. They don't make the laws, they actually police the laws, if you like, or they inspect compliance with the laws that the government puts in place. And some of you may be aware that Ofsted are very active at the moment in terms of research and also making pronouncements about what the shape of the new Ofsted framework, and we do know there will be a new Ofsted framework in September 2019. And Amanda Spillman, the new, or relatively new now, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, has been making several speeches in the last couple of weeks, giving some fairly detailed insights into what that new framework is actually going to look like. And one of the most significant changes is going to be the doing away with the judgment we have at the moment on teaching, learning and assessment, and replacing it with a new standalone judgment, which is going to be called the quality of education. And the quality of education will still reflect teaching, learning and assessment, but will also have an overview of school curriculum. And I think the relevance of this to Pupil Premium is that Ofsted is saying, and Her Majesty's Chief Inspector is saying, there are three elements of what Ofsted will be looking at in this new framework. That's what it looks like at the moment. Those three elements neatly all begin with the letter I. They are intent. What is it the schools want for their children? What's our intention in terms of our vision for those individual children? So again, we think about that from a Pupil Premium perspective. What do we want for our disadvantaged pupils? Then there's the implementation. How is teaching and learning and assessment actually enabling us to meet that intention, to actually realise that vision we've got? And then the third one, impact. Are we improving outcomes? And Amanda Spillman in the speech in Southampton last week actually went on to say, yeah, are we improving outcomes? The impact of that is results and wider outcomes. So again, coming back to that idea that this isn't just about academic performance, this is actually about future life chances we're talking about. So Ofsted's view here, I think, is quite important, and I think we will see that shape our own thinking in schools moving forward. I've got a question has come in here from Rose. How often in the school year is the impact on spending of Pupil Premium assessed? That's a little bit of a piece of, how long's a piece of string question in many ways, Rose. As often as the school wants to. I would suggest it probably will be variable depending on the number of Pupil Premium generating pupils you have in your school, but also on what's the spectrum of need. What's the crossover? I would expect every time governors are looking at data in their schools, and I would expect that to be at least termly, I would expect every time governors are looking at data for them to be focusing on those significant groups of pupils in their school. At the very least, we'd be wanting to look at performance of, based on gender, boys versus girls, but we ought to be looking at special needs if it's a significant group in our school. We ought to be looking at disadvantage if it's a significant group in the school. Ofsted have gone to great lengths to bust what they call a few myths in the system in recent years, and the one thing that they've said in the last 12 months is that we shouldn't focus overly on groups of pupils that are not significant in the school. Now, a lot of schools are saying, oh, Ofsted don't care about groups anymore. That absolutely is not the case. And if the number of disadvantaged pupils in your school is a significant one, and I would say more than 5% is significant, less than 5% may be significant in some schools, then certainly it is something we should focus on. And again, specifically answering your question, Rose, I would see that every time the governing body meets, they should be reviewing performance, and that should include those pupils who generate Pupil Premium. You may not necessarily think about reviewing the spending on every time. That may sit in a different committee or a different part of the governing body. Okay, well, another comment here coming in from Russia. People are talking about spending the money inclusively. Can the money benefit non-Pupil Premium grant generators, or must it be spent only on Pupil Premium pupils? I think schools are accountable for how they spend that money. The government has always been quite intent on saying the money is not ring-fenced. That means you can spend it on whole school projects, but you are then accountable for demonstrating that that has actually made a difference to your Pupil Premium generating pupils. I think one of the things that I would say is that I've been aware of the last 6-7 years or so since Pupil Premium's been around at lots of schools doing whole school activities which perhaps do improve shall we say, academic performance for all pupils. That's fine. You know, we could argue, put a very good argument together to say that yes, that has improved a lot of pupil premium generating pupils. But think about the whole idea of pupil premium is narrowing that gap, closing that gap, diminishing the difference, whatever we want to call it. But actually, if the whole school is moving forward in its learning because of what we're doing, then I think we have to question as governors, is that really in the spirit of what pupil premium is actually intended for? And we've got another question here coming in from Gemma. As the funding is received at 2 points in the year, is there a benefit to breaking down the strategy to reflect this? My personal view on that, Gemma, is probably a very simple no. I think schools need to have plans for what they're doing for children and young people for their whole career in the school, and they should think about following assessment on entry, some form of assessment on entry, what interventions are needed to support that pupil. And then I think rather than thinking of having a little box of money following that child around, it's about what's the pot of money in the school and how do we use that to best meet the needs of all disadvantaged pupils. So I hope that answers those questions. Thank you for those, and do keep those kind of questions coming, folks. I want to move on now just to launch the first poll of the webinar this morning. And the question for the first poll is, has your governing body actually, sorry, this is the second poll. Why is that actually? Sorry, there's a slight problem there. I think we missed out the first poll earlier on. Apologies. That was a technical glitch earlier. Sorry about that, folks. Let's just go straight to this poll here, because I think this is actually relevant to what we're talking about this morning. Apologies there. And that's really to ask you the question, does your governing body or your trust board have a published pupil premium strategy on its website? And I'm launching the poll now, and you ought to be able to see that on your screen. So if I could ask you to respond now, that would be great. Thank you. I can see a lot of people already voted. We're up to the high 70% already. So keep those votes coming in. I'll give you another couple of moments just to do that, and then we'll close the poll and share the results with you. So a few people haven't voted yet. Now's your chance, folks, because I'm going to close the poll any minute now. And that's just about everybody. So the poll is now closed. And I will put the results up on screen now. So hopefully you can see those results in front of you. That's great, 56%, it is a majority just, have actually said that, yeah, there is a published pupil premium strategy within your governing body, within your school or your trust. That's great, because that's a statutory requirement if you're a maintained school. Now, that could be, of course, that 44% of those listening this morning are in academies. That may be the case. You got 11% have said no, but a rather worrying 33% don't know. This is now a rather important aspect of statutory compliance, I would suggest. So if you're one of the people that said, I don't know, go back to school and check, or you don't even go back to school. When you're back at your desk after the webinar this morning, if you've got a spare 30 seconds, get your school's website up there and have a look, because if you're a maintained school, it's a statutory responsibility. Okay, so we've got a couple of more comments here. Yes, Fiona's saying, no, they don't, should they? I hope I've just answered that. And another Fiona, I'm a new governor, but I've just checked, and yes, they do have. Good stuff, Fiona. You've joined a good school, clearly, and that, or certainly a compliant school as far as its website is concerned. So thank you for sharing that. That's helpful. Okay, so I said we'd look at a template for what a pupil premium strategy looks like. I realise this, depending on how you're viewing the webinar this morning, this may not be that easy to read, but this comes from the Teaching Schools Alliance. And the teaching schools are doing more and more work now to hopefully shape good practice in our schools. And this is just the front page of a template that they've produced for schools to use if they choose. It's not mandatory. Having a strategy is mandatory. Using this template is not, but I personally think it's actually quite helpful. So you can see there's a bit of summary information at the top and some information in terms of basic data about the school. Nothing there that wouldn't be a surprise to any of us, I would suggest. For me, the most useful part, and the reason why I wanted to put this bit of a template up on the screen for you this morning, is section number 3 there. So the shaded grey bit about halfway down that box that's on the slide in front of you. Barriers to future attainment for pupils eligible for Pupil Premium. It's rather clumsily worded, but hey. But thinking about those barriers to learning, schools hopefully will know those already, but this is really helpful information for governors. It's not just interesting, it's helpful, useful information, because if as governors we know what the barriers to learning for our Pupil Premium pupils are, then hopefully we can actually discern whether we believe that the strategies that the school is putting in place to try and remove those barriers are effective, and therefore we can actually have a view to how will we judge the impact of what the school's doing. And I think that is absolutely crucial to the way in which governors think, but also the way in which actually governors ask their questions going forward. And I mentioned the Education Endowment Foundation a little bit earlier. This session isn't about the day-to-day operational aspects of Pupil Premium in school, but certainly a good question to go back to schools to ask, as I mentioned earlier, is, are you aware of the Education Endowment Foundation? But an even better question is, do we use the research that's published on there? There are now in excess of 40 different research projects covering all phases of education, and what they do is look at the cost of implementing a particular strategy, the difference it actually makes to pupils, and also what the weight of evidence to support that strategy is. Because I think since Pupil Premium first came out, a lot of schools were deciding amongst themselves what they should actually do, what they shouldn't do, and it wasn't evidentially based. There is now a huge amount of evidence available for schools to look at. A lot of schools historically, for example, have said, well, okay, we've got extra money, let's put more teaching assistants into classrooms. More TAs equals a very good way of spending Pupil Premium. But does it make a difference? And there is research that came from an organisation called the Sutton Trust, which is linked to the Education Endowment Foundation, quite a few years ago now, that said in terms of that correlation between cost and impact, throwing extra bodies, i.e. extra members of staff, at disadvantaged children is the least effective. Yes, it makes a difference, but it's at a very high cost. There are other lower cost, higher effectiveness strategies that schools can use. And I can see that Sandra's just put a question out, is the document available to use if we join your website? Certainly the link is on our website, but yeah, I wouldn't want you to think I'm coercing you into signing up to Better Governor, even though I think it's a great idea. Yes, you'll find it there, Sandra, but actually Google, or there are other search engines available, of course, whatever search engine you want, just put Education Endowment Foundation into that and you will go straight to the EEF website, and it's free access to everybody. But schools should be accessing that website, schools should be using it. And again, as governors, we should be questioning the strategies that we're putting in place. So yeah, we might have a whole raft of intervention strategies being used to support Pupil Premium pupils in our schools. How do we know they're working? If they're not working, what are we doing about it? How long do we wait until we question, should we still be spending money this way? So I think there are some very important lines of questioning that come out of the use of this Pupil Premium strategy. If you go onto the DFE website, for example, and again put into the search facility there, Pupil Premium Strategy, you will find the link to this particular template that I'm actually talking about today, but as I say, the link is on Better Governor as well. Perhaps what we'll do through Governors for Schools is actually just put an email out, I'm sure that's a possibility, to give you these key links after this morning's webinar, if that would be helpful. Got a question coming from Helen. What time of year should the annual strategy be set? That's quite a good question, Helen. I think, again, it depends would be the first part of my answer. I think it depends on what kind of school you are, in terms of primary, secondary, etc., how long you've got pupils for. So I would see it revisited every year, and of course new pupils coming in at the beginning of each year. So a lot of schools will be thinking about that strategy in the summer term and probably revisiting it. And again, it doesn't need to be rewritten every year, but we'll be revisiting it every time they update the other statutory information that goes on the website, because the other statutory information on the website must include performance data for disadvantaged pupils. So a lot of schools in the early part of the autumn term, once they've got their SATs results, their GCSE results, etc., will be updating the website, and that's just a timely opportunity. But there's no hard and fast rules. You can do it whenever you'd like to. Okay, so let's just move forward on to my next and penultimate slide, which is really focusing on the sort of questions that governors ought to be asking. And there's some quite simple questions here, and there are some rather more searching questions, as I've actually described them. And the first one, which is probably a fairly daft question in many ways, is, well, how many pupils in our school actually attract Pupil Premium? And yeah, the answer is a simple number, but I would suggest that that's significant, not least of all because, of course, that will determine how much funding is coming in and what scope there is for perhaps slightly higher levels of creativity in terms of how that funding is actually being spent. We've already talked about our definition of disadvantage in the school, but of course Pupil Premium pupils may not, as we've already said, be the only disadvantaged pupils in our school. So are there other pupils in the school who are disadvantaged and perhaps share some of those barriers to learning that we've identified in our Pupil Premium strategy, or perhaps have their own barriers to learning? And what are we doing about that? Is there a difference in performance? Yeah, is there that gap? Are we trying to actually close that gap or diminish that difference in performance between all Pupil Premium pupils and all others? So there's quite a few questions just coming in at the moment. Question here from Simon. Here in Lambeth, we're advised to get Pupil Premium strategy onto the website in September. Yeah, as I say, Simon, I think that's good. That's good advice. It's not statutory. You are expected to have all other elements updated annually, and of course, September for most schools will be the first opportunity to do that. So yeah, it does make perfect sense. Question from Louise here, sorry, statement from Louise. The Education Endowment Fund data at the start compares the gap for pupils on free school meals with disadvantaged as well as SEN. If most schools are defining disadvantaged as SEN, then how is disadvantaged defined in the charts? Okay, Louise, I mean, I would say that Education Endowment Foundation do tend to take a much broader view. So they are looking at all of those categories that could potentially reflect disadvantage. So all of those categories that are actually represented in both of those charts I showed at the start of the session could potentially have disadvantaged pupils within them and could potentially all be disadvantaged. I mean, even the gender one, you know, boys versus girls. Boys very often do represent a very significant achievement gap, shall we say, from girls in a similar setting. That's a disadvantage, and schools would need to look at, you know, are there implications for the range of reading materials, for the range of topics that we use to perhaps motivate and inspire boys to start writing? All of those things are significant factors, but they are actually barriers to learning. So I think we should view all of those as potential elements within our definition of disadvantage. Oh, thank you, Louise. Louise has just said that makes sense. So I'm delighted to that, because that's not always the case with what I say. And sorry, I've just demonstrated that I'm moving the slides the wrong way when I shouldn't have done. Apologies. Okay, so going back to our questions, folks. Do we know what those barriers of learning are? Again, for me, irrespective of how you organise governance in your school, whether you have committee structure or whether you just have perhaps half-termly meetings of the full governing body meeting, of the full governing body, sorry. This should be, I think, something that all governors are aware of. Governors ought to know what the barriers to learning in all of our schools are, so that we then can ask the key question, so what are we doing about it? How we make those decisions about funding, I think that's an important question for me, because certainly the anecdotal evidence that I hear, and certainly my own experience in schools that I visit in my day job, is that very often you'll find that, particularly in schools where they have a finance committee, the finance committee is responsible for making decisions about how Pupil Premium is spent because they see it as a budgetary issue. Well, yes, it might be, but I think there needs to be a rather more holistic view of this. So I would always say this is probably a whole governing body decision, because there has got to be some kind of oversight that says this is what we need to do, linked back to the pupil premium strategy. This is how we're going to spend the funding available to us. And I think from a financial perspective, I would be expecting governing bodies to be thinking purely of how much money do we get in for pupil premium? Can we demonstrate that we are spending it to have the greatest potential impact on those pupils who are generating the funding? So funding is clearly important here. We are accountable for it, and so for some of us it'll be quite significant. And of course, the most important question of all is that one about impact. So are we making any difference at all? The big so what question. And I think for too many of us as governors, we have perhaps sat by and talked about the fact that there has been a gap between the performance of non-disadvantaged and disadvantaged pupils in our schools for quite a few years now. But the idea of challenge is challenging the status quo, and lots of schools traditionally have put all that money perhaps into an extra teacher, perhaps, as I said earlier, into extra TAs, teaching assistants in the school. But if it's not making a difference, it's us as governors who should be challenging that and saying, well, what are other schools doing? Have we looked at the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit and explored some of those other strategies? Because the most significant aspect of all of this is pupil premium should make a difference, and it's our responsibility to ensure that it does. Okay, well, that is my last slide, folks, other than to say, are there any questions that we haven't addressed yet? If you've got any other questions, now is your opportunity to either post them up on the dashboard, or, as I say, if you want to raise your hand and come on live and answer a question, I'd be happy to unmute you. Okay, we have a question coming from Helen here. Other than reporting impact on academic outcomes, what could we report? Well, I think the world's your oyster on that one, Helen. I think you could report, and I would be encouraging schools to report everything that they think they have done to improve the life chances of those disadvantaged pupils in their school. Some of it may have no price tag attached to it at all. It may just be about how staff are deployed. Lots of schools now are funding nurture groups, are funding ELSA, are funding lots of other emotional and well-being situations in their school. And pupils accessing those, that could actually be about putting them in the right place where learning becomes possible, as opposed to having a direct impact on academic outcomes. So I think it's about our context as schools, it's about what we know about that as governors, and I think it's about asking all of those questions. So yeah, what do we do to support our pupils in the round, in a more holistic way? And let's share that as well. Abigail has put a comment up on here. The EEF analysis of TA use is not favourable. No, absolutely, that was a comment I made earlier. However, maximising the use of TAs is a research handbook that makes clear on how they've had a positive impact. Yeah, absolutely right, Abigail. It is all about deployment, and of course it's no coincidence there that when Ofsted come into our schools, one of the things that they look at is how effectively our teaching assistants or learning assistants, whatever they're called in school, how are they deployed, and are they deployed in a way that makes a positive difference to outcomes for pupils. Question from Roseanne here. Are schools allowed to use pupil premium towards extra activities clubs for SEN children outside school? Providing you can actually demonstrate that it's actually making a difference in outcomes, then yes, absolutely. Depends on what those clubs are, and I think governors should be asking questions about what the intended impact is, because for me, too many governors will, and forgive me saying this, sort of take the Moses approach that the tablets of stone are the school strategy here, and we sit around and worship it all year rather than actually ask questions about are they the right words that have been scribed on those tablets. So for me, it's about questioning the plan. If we're proposing to use pupil premium towards extracurricular activities or clubs for SEN children or any other group of disadvantaged children, what's the rationale behind it? What difference do we want this to make to pupils' lives? I've seen pupil premium money being spent on providing uniform to some children. That's a great social cohesion way of spending money that means that children's self-esteem, self-confidence may be improved. They feel that they fit in better in school. That has a positive impact, slightly less tangible, but nonetheless can have a positive impact on the achievement of those children. Comment here from Simon, suggestion, have a look at the Pupil Premium strategy on the website of other schools in your area. That's a great idea, Simon. It gives you a feel for a range of things other schools are doing. Yes, it absolutely does. Again, hopefully those schools will have actually thought about what the impact is, and there will be some information on that as well. But if they're local schools to you, as governors, suggest that head teachers or whoever is leading on disadvantage in your school has a conversation with those schools. They may already be having those conversations, but yeah, think about that without any doubt whatsoever. Okay, well, that looks as if all the questions have been exhausted, folks. So just to say thank you very much indeed for joining the webinar this morning. There have been a lot of people here. Lots of questions. Thank you for that. It's very lonely sitting here in front of a couple of screens if nobody does ask questions, so sincerely thank you for that. We will make sure that those URLs are actually sent out by Governors for School. I'm sure that won't be a problem, and look forward to seeing you again at the next webinar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.